Chapter 13. Adian. Sonic Boom. It was a trap. It was a trap. It was a trap. The thought ran on repeat in Adian's head as he fought for survival with his companions. He tried to sharpen his focus when he noticed one of the diseased bears coming towards him. He yelled out to Olive, even as he continued to activate war songs, with a hectic melody that cut through the cacophony of the battle. Immediately, arrows began sprouting from the creature, but Olive was obviously saving his most powerful offensive weapons. Unfortunately, his more mundane attacks weren't even slowing it. Adian contemplated using Sonic Boom to stop it. He had wanted to use the ability ever since the trap had been sprung, but he would only be able to use it once in this battle, and he needed to make sure it wasn't at an opportune moment. This seemed like as good a time as any, though, so he called for his group to clear a path in front of him as he prepared to unleash his most devastating ability, when all of a sudden a large form rushed past him and through the gap his team had just made. It was Dre. What was he doing? Adian watched in horrified fascination as Dre bowled over a Ratgor, leaped into the air, and brought a giant sword that he must have had in his pack down on the head of the monstrous bear. Dre's lack of experience was evident, though, as he used the flat of the blade in his attack and not the sharp edge. Miraculously, the blow was still strong enough to knock the bear unconscious, but not before its huge weight crashed down on top of Dre. "No!" Adian yelled as he rushed forwards. If the force and weight of the creature hadn't already done him in, then suffocation would soon. His fear spiked even more when the bear's body began to move. Had the creature regained consciousness so quickly? But no. The creature's head still lolled to the side, unaware. Somehow, it was Dre. He lifted the bear with his arms and legs, his back pinned to the ground. Almost immediately, though, the body started to descend. Adian tried to increase his pace to help the obviously struggling man, but before he could assist him, Dre let out a screaming grunt. He heaved the bear off of himself, and onto a couple unlucky Ratgor beside him. Adian slowly came to a stop and stared down at Dre in awe and befuddlement. When the young man started to stand up, he ran forward and helped pull him to his feet. Before he could start shouting at the boy about the pure stupidity of his actions, he caught sight of the gasping man's eyes. His bloodshot, crazed eyes. That's when everything fell into place. Adian sighed. He couldn't fault the boy for his choice. That potion was more than likely the only reason Dre wasn't paralyzed with fear. Instead of berating him, Adian tried to pull the Pac-Man back towards the relative safety of the rest of the militia. Not only was he unsuccessful in even budging the Pac-Man, but Dre managed to pull him forward a couple paces. Dre's crazed mind was pushing him ever forwards. But why? Adian looked beyond Dre and groaned. The thing, or more accurately, the things that had captured Dre's attention were horribly obvious. The remaining 3 bears were lumbering towards him from the far side of the battle, and they were starting to pick up speed. Adian looked to his sides and saw the rest of his team holding off the Ratgor. They could probably take the creatures down in a straight-up fight, but at what cost? Adian shook his head. The price was too high. He called out to the others. "I need you to hold back Dre. He took a berserking potion, and he wants to face those bears head-on. I think that it's too risky, so I'm going to use Sonic Boom on the bears instead. It may not finish them off, but it should stun them at the very least." After receiving nods of agreement from his team, he turned to Dre and shouted, "I need my trombone!" Dre stared back at him blankly. Adian sighed. "Get out my weird instrument with the slidey thing, now!" Dre's drugged mind responded to the command in Adian's voice, and he pulled out the bronze instrument. Adian quickly swapped it with his violin. After ensuring that Marcia and Gavin were positioned beside Dre and that Olive and Miene were protecting his flanks, he took a deep breath. Then he ran towards the large, tainted monsters. When he was as close as he could get while still keeping the beast within the cone of the attack, he activated Sonic Boom with a thought. He was immediately struck with an uncomfortable but familiar feeling as his chest expanded. He deeply inhaled once, twice, thrice, and then 3 more times, all until it felt as if his lungs would burst out of his ribcage. He brought the trombone to his mouth, adjusted his aim slightly, and then released all the withheld air in a ferocious buzzing that numbed his lips. What emerged out of the bell of the trombone was not music. It was barely even sound. It was a physical wave of force that blasted out in a cone in front of Adian. It flung nearby Ratgor off of their feet and brought the bears to a dazed halt, with blood trickling out of ruptured ears. To Adian's great surprise, though, the attack didn't stop there. This ability was still quite new to him, not necessarily in terms of time, but in terms of use. It was his hidden ace, and he tended to only use it when absolutely necessary, since it wasn't immediately repeatable. In fact, it was his only skill so far that had what was colloquially known as a long cooldown. Besides that, he had only ever used it in wide open places. It was always incredibly loud to everyone nearby, but the true potency of the attack was reserved for those unfortunate enough to get caught in its cone of force. However, in a cavern with solid stone walls, the forceful sound wave no longer had near infinite space to expand and dissipate into. Instead, it reacted how sound usually does in such an environment. It echoed. The powerful sound wave careened off the jagged stone wall opposite Adian. It broke into hundreds of auditory fragments and reflected in just as many directions. Those sound fragments continued on until they hit a wall and then repeated the cycle. Each collision softened the intensity, but increased the overall reach of the skill. Instead of a singular note from a trombone, it sounded like a full orchestra of trombones all playing one note in a chaotic cacophony. Instead of only one powerful cone of impact, it was a series of decreasingly potent cones of audible force that crisscrossed the entire cavern, leaving no one place entirely untouched, but overlapping again and again and again in the middle of the cavern, where all the monsters were congregated. By the time the sound attack had died out, Adian was the only living thing within the cave left standing. He stared out in shock at the devastation that his skill had wrought on both friend and foe alike. By the grace of the Creator, the monsters seemed to have taken the brunt of the attack. The humans may have fallen to their knees, but almost all of the monsters had collapsed fully on the ground. Adian wasn't sure if it was just the luck of their location within the room, or if these dungeon monsters had some sort of magical weakness to sonic attacks. Perhaps it was even more simple, and the extremely sensitive ears of the beasts were the reason for the discrepancy. The thought of ears made him realize that the only sound that he could hear was a loud ringing. He brought his hand next to his ears and snapped forcefully. Nothing. He tried to move, but he stumbled, and had to stagger forward a few steps before he caught his balance. He began to shake his head, but stopped immediately as a piercing headache flared. Instead, he released a heavy sigh. This was the first time that he had experienced the effects of his own attack, and he couldn't help but feel a little sympathy for those he had used it on before. The disorientation it caused seemed much less silly on the receiving end. He looked around and saw that many of the militia members, including his own team, were unsteadily getting to their feet. He started towards his team, hoping to be able to help them somehow, when he noticed a rat gore to his right twitch. He turned and saw one of the bear monsters begin to stir. They were down, but they weren't dead yet. He waved his arms around wildly until he had gained some attention, and then pointed out the moving creatures. Hopefully they could figure out what to do next by themselves. He bent to pick up his trombone, which he had dropped after the attack, but instead he grabbed a sword that had been discarded nearby. He traveled from creature to creature and stabbed them in an eye or in any convenient, vulnerable area, prioritizing the most fidgety creatures. Adian wasn't going to complain, but the monsters were taking far longer to recover than seemed reasonable. He was starting to think that either their infection or potentially their connection to the dungeon made them more vulnerable to his attack somehow. He didn't have the energy to think too hard about it, though. Things had ended up working out well. Surprisingly well, really. Even still, Adian berated himself the entire time he went about the grisly task. He should have realized the potential for powerful reverberation in such an enclosed space. He had learned music from a master musician, after all. They had obviously analyzed tempo, rhythm, melody, and all the directly musical topics in excruciating detail. The brilliant man's lessons hadn't stopped there, though. They had also discussed a wide range of topics varying from the sound quality of different instrument materials all the way to how to effectively manage varied types of crowds. One such discussion topic was about how the size, shape, and wall material of a venue could drastically change the sound quality and volume of a performance. That knowledge, coupled with multiple experiences traveling through echo-filled rock wall gorges, allowed him no excuse to have not at least thought about the consequences of unleashing his sound attack within the cavern. Before too long, all the creatures in the room had either been finished off or had managed to skitter away into one of the many foreboding, dark tunnels that sporadically dotted the cavern walls. The darkness of the tunnels seemed odd to Adian, but it took him a few moments to realize why. Ever since they had entered the dungeon, things had been so chaotic that he hadn't had a chance to question his surroundings. The tunnels were dark, which made sense. What didn't make sense was that he was in a cave, and it wasn't. He looked up and for the first time noticed the reason for the greenish light that suffused his environment. The ceiling was completely covered in a carpet of glowing green moss. Adian's first realization was that it looked very similar to the moss that had covered many of the trees within the infected forest. His second was amazement at the plant's ability to provide so much light. Dre probably had some sort of glass jar in his pack that they could collect and store some of the luminous plant. Having a sustainable, non-burning light source would be incredibly useful. It might even be profitable if they could collect enough. Miners and other such classes must have a need for... He shook his head away from the comfortable distraction. Now wasn't the time for entrepreneurial schemes. He needed all of his attention to answer one simple yet seemingly impossible question. How are they going to get out of here? Adian's gaze flicked between the many tunnels. Some of them seemed normal enough, but others were emerging from the ceiling or high up on the wall. They all varied in size, some minuscule, some massive. A house could have been pushed through one of them in particular, and a large house at that. Before he had a chance to decide which tunnel was most promising for escape, he heard a voice say, "Group." At least, that is what it sounded like to Adian. He turned around and looked back towards where it had originated from. Rucker had both hands cupped around his mouth and appeared to be shouting as loudly as he could. "Group up." Was he trying to say group up? Adian made his way back towards the captain. Everyone else was doing the same. He noticed for the first time, and with relief, that Dre didn't seem too much worse for wear from the sonic attack bounce back. Even more importantly, the manic look in his eyes was gone. The initial and most potent ramifications of the Berserker potion appeared to have worn off already. The more subtle effects would linger far longer. It was troubling that this was the first he had thought of him since the Sonic Boom debacle. Or honestly, was it actually the Sonic Boom miracle? It was highly unlikely that their situation would be any better if his attack hadn't been so effective against the dungeon creatures. It could have been much, much worse. Regardless, he should have paid better attention to Dre before, during, and after the battle. It was his responsibility to protect the young Pac-Man, and he had done a very poor job of it so far. He allowed himself a few moments of recrimination until he got close enough for his impaired ears to understand what Rucker was saying mid-sentence. "Now how long we have? We need to get healed up, and we need to get out of here before any more creatures decide to attack." He paused when he noticed Adian approach, and after a moment's hesitation he said, "That was one hell of an attack, Field Musician Adian." The captain gave a slight, nearly imperceptible nod before he turned to Dre, who was standing beside him, and began listing the things that he needed from Dre's pack. Adian was shocked by the acknowledgement from Rucker, but it was clear that even if he had miscalculated, his actions had more than likely saved lives. He looked around at the menagerie of twisted corpses around him. Then he looked up and prayed under his breath. "Thanks for using me to get us out of that mess with minimal casualties. Please don't leave us now, though. We still need your help. We still need a way out of here." After his silent prayer, Adian took stock of their current situation. 3 were dead, which was a tragedy that deserved to be laid at the feet of Rucker. Adian pushed down the rage before it could truly take hold of his weary heart. Now was not the time to distribute blame. And if the captain's startling show of humility could be trusted, it might mean that the man already blamed himself. Besides the fatalities, none of the injuries were severe enough that they couldn't be mended with a generous dose of healing potion. Considering the numerical disadvantage they had been fighting under, that was nearly miraculous in and of itself. Another silver lining was that their best scout had made it through the battle. The tall man, with a spine curved from a life full of stooped tracking, stood frozen, his bulbous nose lifted high into the air. Adian raised an eyebrow quizzically before he remembered that the strange man's tracking skills were heavily reliant on his heightened sense of smell. The scout waved the captain over, and then his gaze passed over Adian, and he repeated the gesture. When the two of them had converged onto the scout's position, he grimaced and spoke in a nasally tone. "The sickly smell of rot permeates everything here, but 2 of the tunnels do smell slightly fresher than the others. If I had to bet, then I would put my coin on at least one of them leading to the surface." He pointed to the 2 tunnels in question, which were on opposite sides of the cavern. "I don't have any reason to choose one over the other. As far as I could tell, they are both used quite often. Should we be prioritizing speed or defensibility at this point?" He addressed the question towards the captain, but his gaze flickered questioningly a few times in Adian's direction, a gesture that was not missed by Rucker. The captain's eye twitched, but his only other action was to move a few paces away and beckon Adian to join him. "What's the cooldown on that attack?" the captain asked in a little more than a whisper. Adian locked eyes with the man for long moments before he sighed and replied in a similarly soft tone. "Around a full day." Rucker grunted, not in surprise but in resignation. "I thought that might be the case. We still have some powerful skills ready to use amongst us, but..." He hesitated, and his eyes wandered around the cavern as he asked, Any thoughts on how we get out of this hellhole of a dungeon? Adian almost couldn't comprehend what was happening. Did Rucker just admit that he was wrong? Was the captain really asking him, of all people, for help? Adian realized too late that he was letting his confusion show on his face. Rucker just smirked darkly in response. I don't like you much, and I know the feeling is mutual, but now isn't the time for such foolish squabbles. I freely admit that I have made mistakes, but try to believe me when I say that I have never intentionally been reckless with the lives of my men. Let's put aside our differences for now and try to get all of us out of here alive. He paused as a small, almost friendly grin grew on his face. We'll have more than enough time to kill each other later. Adian nodded his head slowly. He still didn't trust the man as far as he could throw him, but in this situation it did seem that they were aligned on the sole objective of survival. He thought for a moment on Rucker's initial question before he responded. Before we can decide how to get out of here, we need to make sure we agree on our current predicament. Rucker nodded, and Adian continued. As far as I can tell, we were caught in a fairly common dungeon trick. The main entrance teleports you to the opposite end of the dungeon. That way you are forced to fight through all the dangers within, expelling powerful skills and magics that the dungeon can siphon from without the option for retreat. It makes no sense, though. This dungeon can't be nearly mature enough for such a potent trap. From everything I have gathered, the first sign of this dungeon popped up little more than a couple weeks ago, and that means that we are more than likely the first people to enter it. Where could it have gotten the power from? Rucker bobbed his head from side to side, uncertainty evident in his expression. It shouldn't be possible. Not unless the origin artifact was mythically powerful. Adian nodded. Agreed, but if the artifact in this cave system was really so powerful, wouldn't there already be a mature dungeon here? Truly formidable artifacts don't need sentient dungeon bound in the same way that lesser ones do. At least that's what I've heard. So the item of power must have been uncovered recently, and then bonded immediately. That's all I can think of, which means this dungeon might have been intentionally planted. That seems more plausible than such a series of nearly impossible circumstances happening at random. It's even worse if this dungeon isn't new. In that case, we are dealing with an incredibly old dungeon with the ability and foresight to hide itself beyond memory. In that unfortunate circumstance, we would be dealing with a dungeon that is well beyond our level, Adian replied. Rucker's face paled slightly. It doesn't really change things for us. Either way, all that matters to us is escape. True enough, but any information we can glean could save future lives. Anger flared in the captain's eyes, but he kept his tone relatively civil. You can worry about future lives if you want, but I'm going to focus on the present ones. Adian wanted to say that escaping and gathering useful information weren't mutually exclusive, but it simply wasn't worth it. Besides, Rucker was right about the priority. If they didn't make it out alive, then any information they managed to gather was completely useless. So instead, he brought the conversation back to what the scout had asked them. I'm leaning towards the smaller tunnel. It might slow us down slightly, but there are few enough of us that it shouldn't be significant. It will make it much harder for us to be surrounded, which greatly reduces the effectiveness of the dungeon's numerical advantage. Rucker looked like he wanted to argue, but after a long moment he just nodded, before waving everyone over. He spit out some quick instructions, and in what felt like no time at all, the small group was walking quickly towards the smaller of the two fresh-smelling tunnels. Although to Adian's nose, nothing was remotely fresh about the stenches encapsulating them. He looked in disgust at the corpses all around them. He had to suppress his nausea after the thought of what the cave would smell like once the rotting began crossed his mind. Adian searched out Dre as they approached the tunnel. He was easy enough to spot with his large frame and nearly comically sized pack. The young man was pale as a ghost, and Adian didn't blame him. If his first experience of battle had been anything like this one, then he would more than likely be far away, comfortably playing with an orchestra in a throne room right now. Maybe it would have been better that way. The first time's always the most extreme when it comes to those kinds of potions, he said. You were reckless, but you survived. That's all that matters. I should be dead. If it wasn't for you, I would be. I never want to lose control like that again. But before he could continue, Adian's gaze shot to the tunnel that they were approaching. What was that sound? It started out as a low kind of rumbling, but it was steadily growing louder and louder. Something's coming, Adian yelled. To the other tunnel! Run! He turned and started sprinting towards the opposite side of the cavern, Dre by his side. Adian tossed the sword he'd still been carrying to the ground and called for Dre to remove the marching drum from his pack. Dre grabbed it quickly and handed the awkward instrument to him while trying not to slow down. After a few moments of struggle, Adian managed to put it on. By that time, they were about a quarter of the way across the cavern, and the two of them were well behind the rest of the militia. Adian crooked his neck back just in time to see the first creatures pouring out of the tunnel. There were more of the sickly ratgore and leopards, but also infected deer, wolves, foxes, and pretty much any woodland creature imaginable. Adian pushed down the panic and started playing a quick marching rhythm. Almost immediately, he felt the customary surge of speed that always came from motivational march, but at a strength that he could only manage with a drum. Adian surged forward with Dre right beside him. His skills tended to have slightly larger effect on himself than others, but with Dre's physical strength and natural speed, he was able to keep pace with Adian, even with the giant pack. After a quick glance back, Adian spent a valuable breath to shout a plea towards the ceiling. The fastest of the creatures were still gaining ground. Adian and Dre tried and failed to catch up with the group, who had all noticeably quickened with Adian's skill bolstering them. When they were almost to the mouth of their target tunnel, Adian chanced to look backwards once again. He saw in horror that the creatures were now almost 3/4 of the way across the room. He redoubled his efforts and entered the tunnel at a sprint, into almost complete darkness. He stumbled, but was able to orient himself when a small amount of shaky light managed to find its way to him from somewhere ahead in the tunnel. Someone must have lit a torch or something. He continued along the incline of the tunnel at a pace that made his lungs and legs burn, but before his strength gave out, the tunnel leveled off, and he was able to see all the remaining militia members in front of him, his old team included. He managed a sigh of relief in between his hissing breaths, but it quickly turned into a hiss of frustration when he was unable to find one particular face. Where in damnation was Dre?